And we are now live on Facebook and we are recording. Welcome everybody to Lit Balm number 82, I believe. I didn't actually do the count today, but either way, we've been going since the beginning of the pandemic until now. We were first weekly, now we're bi-weekly with an occasional interjection, which will happen from time to time during the course of the year. But tonight, we are absolutely delighted to have the Denise Levertov Extravaganza, which is a special feature tonight on the life and work of Denise. And it features Arthur Tse, Margo Taft Stever, Dick Lourie, Susan Eisenberg, David Shaddock, and Donna Krolik Hollenberg, who will be interviewing Mark about Denise and her life and work. And like I said earlier, before we went live, I'm a big fan myself of Denise's. She particularly informed me in poetic language, and for that I'm eternally grateful. And to commence the show, as always, we hosts will be reading a poem before we commence the foray. And I'm delighted to introduce Jonathan Penton, who is not here tonight. Unfortunately has other commitments in Louisiana. But Jonathan is one of our co-founders, and he founded Unlikely Stories, an electronic journal of literature and art in 1998. He's lent his editorial and management assistance to many literary and artistic ventures, including the New Orleans Poetry Festival, Big Bridge, Mad Hat, and Rigorous. In 2005, he founded Unlikely Books, which publishes 3 to 5 books of poetry a year. He's organized literary performances and performed himself across the United States. His poetry books are Last Chap, Blood and Seltzer and Painting Rust, Prosthetic Gods, Standards of Sanity, and the free chapbook Backstories, which you can download from Jeffrey Side's Argotist ebooks. I believe Cassandra will be reading one of Jonathan's poems tonight.
Going to. I should start with alrighty then, because that's a Jonathanism. I'm going to read one of Jonathan's poems called Heroic Man, and it's an ekphrastic piece, and it's a really beautiful piece. My skull is very small. Everyone notices. People describe me as having a wisdom of the body. In some mouths, that means I'm beautiful. In all mouths, that means I'm a fool. Now I am scarred, covering one arm, both shoulder blades down one scapula. Now the wisdom of my body is keloid. My skull no longer houses the windows to my soul. So that's from Jonathan Penton.
Nice, nice. He doesn't read enough of his own work, don't you think?
I know, that's why I'm doing it. One by one, I'm going to keep reading them.
And Cassandra, of course, who will be reading in a second, is an award-winning writer, scholar of prose poetry, and professor of writing and literature in Melbourne, Australia. Her most recent books of prose poetry are Pre-Raphaelite, Leftovers, and Fugitive Letters. She is currently writing a book of prose poetry on the atomic bomb with funding from the Australia Council. Cassandra co-wrote an amazing book, probably the most comprehensive book on prose poetry that I've ever read. It's called Prose Poetry, an introduction and the anthology of Australian prose poetry. The first one came out with Princeton University Press, and it is fantastic. Get it. She is commissioning editor for Wesley Magazine. Let's see what you got tonight, Cassandra.
Oh, you're very sweet. I have a prose poem, strangely enough, because that's all I write. So here it is. I exist as a wisp in time, one moment in 10,000. You feel me at the edges of evening, moth wings against a naked bulb. There's a pinch in your spine as I sizzle and become dust. Still, there is a flapping of wings, a speck of glitter on your collar, my scent in your car. You breathe it in and store me in your lungs for the time I'm gone. And I've got the pleasure of introducing Mark Vincennes, and his bio is always so much fun to read because not only is it enviable, but there are parts that we do like a bio karaoke. So feel free to come in at various points when you remember. Mark Vincennes is an Anglo-Swiss American poet, a fiction writer, translator, editor, publisher, designer, multi-genre artist, and musician. He's published 18 books of poetry, including more recently Leaning into the Infinite, The Syndicate of Water and Light, Here Comes the Night Dust, Einstein Fledermaus, and The Little Book of Earthly Delights. Vincennes' newest collection, A Brief Conversation with Consciousness, I hope you went to the launch, it was great, was just released by Unlikely Books. An album of music, ambience, and verse left-hand clapping is forthcoming from Tree Torn Records. Vincennes is also a prolific translator, and he's translated from, yes, the German, Romanian, and French. He has published 10 books of translations, most recently Unexpected Development by award-winning Swiss poet and novelist Klaus Mertz with White Pine in 2018, and it was a finalist for the 2016 Cliff Becker Book Prize in Translation. His translation of Klaus Mertz's selected poems, An Audible Blue, is forthcoming from White Pine Press. He's currently working on a novel entitled The Age of Occasions. It's so fantastic, it's going to blow your mind. I think we're going to do a reading of one of the parts of it later in the year. Vincennes is editor and publisher of Mad Hat Press and publisher of New American Writing. He has, everyone, lived all over the world, from Brazil to China to Iceland to India. He was born in Matilda Hospital on the Peak in Hong Kong, but now lives on a farm in rural western Massachusetts, overlooking Herman Melville's Greylock Mountain, and where, wait for it, there are more acorn, weevils, assassin bugs, and small-eyed sphinx moths than people. Thanks for that tongue twister, Mark. Would you please read something fantastic for us?
They're called weevils, actually. Thank you, Cassandra. This is actually a poem that's called A Stone's Throw, and it's for Denise Levertov. For Denise, in her shadow, follow the veins in her arms. At the river they gather, and all the stones return to life. Less manifest than now, more a sign leading us to where the crystal refracts, where that something becomes divine. Oh yes, we are so easily appeased. With that man at your side, how could you ever be at anyone's mercy? Meaning could be composed of virtually anything, but we want that bell to resound through the foundations. What God has a chance under conditions like that? Watch for the tarantulas here. They sneak through the muddy creek, showing the storms, and yet they always declare, I am ready. Your fingers hold the last fragment beyond the forest. The fragile architectures peter out, pathways, shadows, trestles, and trusses. Oh, the spores of the once possible, a mushroom says. Lay your hands in the Atlantic Ocean and feel how the trickle of compassion enters in. And yes, the porcupines here are particularly spiny. Together, we could face the storm. And right here in the threshold, think of it, threefold. You could lend me your face, or if you were her, you'd be touching the corals, turning your 50-year-old heart for a new sun. Wake up to the droning of time, or that dizzy plunging into a round bowl of reflections. Consider this. Across the rooftops, you appear in the fire, not wildly struggling, down in the shade under a walnut tree. As you reflect, the fish sink into the wake of emergency. All those valleys and ravines, the enormous howl from dawn to dawn, in the awnings, in the architecture, every gesture appears and disappears without a trace. And now I'm just about to introduce a friend of mine, Mark Pawlak, who is the author of 9 poetry collections and the editor of 6 anthologies. His memoir, My University, Knowing Denise Levertov, was just published by Mad Hat Press. Mark's poems and prose have been translated into German, Japanese, Spanish, and Polish. And he has been performed at Teatr Polski in Warsaw. For the past 4 years, Mark has been co-editor of the Brooklyn, 40 years, sorry, of the Brooklyn, New York poetry-based journal and literary press, Hanging Loose. To support his writing habits, he teaches mathematics at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He lives in Cambridge, and Mark will introduce Denise and some of her students and admirers to us tonight.
Thank you, Mark and the Lit Balm crew for hosting this tonight. This is really a great occasion to bring together a lot of old friends and other people related to Denise that I've known about for years, but on one occasion, David Shaddock, I've never actually met until online right now. So welcome. So probably most of us know considerable amount about Denise already, which is why we're all here. But just reflecting what Mark was saying about, that she is not getting the, recently getting the kind of attention that she really deserves. I'm just going to give you a brief kind of summary of her life and work in a sense. So Denise was born in 1923, grew up in a suburb of London, second daughter of a scholarly Jewish father originally from Eastern Europe, who converted and became a minister in the Church of England, and to a Welsh school teacher mother who homeschooled her. As a young woman after the Second World War, she traveled in Europe where she met Mitchell Goodman, an American GI from Brooklyn. They married and settled in New York in 1948. Their son, Nikolai, their only child, was born the following year. They continued to live in Manhattan for the next 30 years with extended sojourns as visiting writers in France, Mexico, California, and in summers to Western Maine, where they owned a farmhouse. In 1969, they relocated to the Boston area, where Denise had a one-year writer in residence appointment at MIT, where I met her, and where Margo and Arthur and several others who are sitting in attending today also met her. They stayed in the area for the next several years until their separation and divorce. Mitch moved permanently to their Temple, Maine farmhouse. Denise bought a house in the Boston suburb of Somerville and joined the faculty of Tufts University, where she remained until 1979. In 1987, she resettled in Seattle, where she lived until her death 10 years ago. My University, this memoir, spans almost 3 decades, starting from when I first met Denise and began to study poetry with her in 1969 as an undergraduate at MIT, and ends with her death in 1997. But its principal focus is the 1970s, when she lived in the Boston area and taught at several universities here. Denise arrived at the MIT campus a rising star of the post-war avant-garde, referred to as the New American Poetry after the 1960 anthology she and others appeared in with that title. She had already published 7 poetry collections and the book of translations. Her 8th collection, Relearning the Alphabet, appeared in 1970, and she would go on to publish an additional 12 poetry collections, another book of translations, a collection of short prose memoirs, and 3 collections of essays. I may have missed something, there's probably even more. Paul Lacey, who was her literary executor, in his afterword to the Denise Levertov selected poems, describes 3 large periods in her literary life, beginning with the first works through O Taste and See, the period when she was praised by the greatest number, these are his words, of critics for her sacramental and celebratory vision, and when she was most obviously influenced by William Carlos Williams and learning American speech. The second, my university concerns the second period, a time when she and I lived in close proximity and spent considerable time together. The years when she wrote the poems that appeared in To Stay Alive, Footprints, Freeing the Dust, Life in the Forest, and when she published her first poetry essay collection, The Poet in the World. Lacey described those years as the second of the three periods of her literary life when she was, quote, most overtly but never exclusively political in her writing, most torn by doubts about her poetic vision, given over to grief at the loss of her sister and her mother, and when her marriage ended. The final period, from Candles in Babylon to The Great Unknowing, was when, again quoting Lacey, was when she had returned to her Christian roots, eventually converting to Catholicism. Living in Seattle, then she was engaged by the sensibilities and themes of some writers of the Northwest. December of this year, 2022, will be the 25th anniversary of her death. I'm going to read one poem from the Jacob's Ladder, an early 1960 collection of Denise's, which refers to her background, her father's Jewish Hasidic side and her mother's Welsh side. It's called Illustrious Ancestors. The Rav of northern White Russia declined in his youth to learn the language of birds because the extraneous did not interest him. Nevertheless, when he grew old, it was found he understood them anyway, having listened well and, as it was said, quote, prayed with the bench and the floor. He used what was at hand, as did Angel Jones of Mold, whose meditations were sewn into coats and breeches. Well, I would like to make thinking some line taught between me and them, poems as direct as the birds said, hard as a floor, sound as a bench, mysterious as the silence when the tailor would pause with his needle in the air.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Next, we'll be hearing from David Shaddock, who met Denise in 1969 when he was a member of her Berkeley Poetry Workshop. His books include Dreams Are Another Set of Muscles, with an introduction by Denise, In This Place Where Something's Missing, Lives, from Vernal Pool and the Book of Splendor, new unselected poems on spiritual themes. David is the author of Poetry and Psychoanalysis, The Opening of the Field. I'm guessing, David, you've probably read Owen Barfield. His column, Poetry and Healing, appears in Poetry Flash. He has a PhD in psychoanalytic research from Middlesex University, London, and maintains a private practice in Berkeley. David and his wife, Toby, were with Denise in Seattle when she passed. Welcome, David.
Thanks. Thank you to Mark for writing his book and for putting this together, or helping to put it together. It's a real honor. I try and do whatever I can to keep. Let's see if I can get this onto this so I can see myself. Can people hear me? I'm not.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. I don't know why this is not going to me. All right. All right, well, I can see myself in the gallery. That's good enough. When I first heard from Mark that he was writing this book or had written it, I thought first, oh shoot, he beat me to it. And then I immediately thought, oh great, now I don't have to write it, because someone should talk about what it was like to be a mentee of Denise and the generosity and nurturing that she offered in general, but especially to the people who were close enough to her to be, the recipient of so much of her wisdom. And if you haven't read Mark's book, you really should. You'll really learn a tremendous amount about poetry and poetics, and also about the nature of human relationships and passing on wisdom, which now we're in many people looking at the gallery are in the position of considering doing. So I've picked this poem, which is the Agnus Dei section, the concluding section of her Mass for the Day of Saint Didymus, who was a doubting Thomas, and she takes a doubting view of the liturgy, or interrogating view of the liturgy, and so I wanted to pick this poem for a number of reasons. I think it's one of her great works, but also I have a very distinct memory of visiting her at Stanford and having her read this to me, read the whole Mass to me in manuscript. And I can remember the way the light felt in her apartment and the silence after she finished. And I said, "Oh, Denise, you've written your masterpiece." And she nodded and said, yes, I think I have. This was a poem that Don and other people, and Denise herself kind of mentioned as contributing to a kind of conversion through writing poetry. So here we go. 6, Agnus Dei. Given that lambs are infant sheep, that sheep are afraid and foolish and lack the means of self-protection, having neither rage nor claws, venom nor cunning. What then is this Lamb of God? This pretty creature vigorous to nuzzle at milky dugs, wool bearer, bleater, leaper in air for delight of being, who finds in astonishment 4 legs to land on, the grass, all it knows of the world, with whom we would like to play, whom we'd lead with ribbons, but may not bring into our houses because it would soil the floor with its droppings. What terror lies concealed in strangest words, O Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world, and innocence smelling of ignorance, born in bloody snowdrifts, licked by forbearing dogs more intelligent than its entire flock put together. God then, encompassing all things, is defenseless. Omnipotence has been tossed away, reduced to a wisp of damp wool. And we, frightened, bored, wanting only to sleep till catastrophe has raged, clashed, seethed, and gone by without us, wanting then to awaken in quietude without remembrance of agony. We who in shamefaced private hope had looked to be plucked from fire and given a bliss we deserved for having imagined it. Is it implied that we must protect this perversely weak animal whose muzzle's nudgings suppose there is milk to be found in us? Must hold to our icy hearts a shivering God? So be it. Come, rag of pungent quiverings, dim star. Let's try if something human still can shield you, spark of remote light. We're just going to make a few general comments about that poem. The first is to say that, Denise and I had many long conversations about religion. And though I certainly was never as religious or concrete or devout as she became, it appeared that through those conversations, I became much more comfortable with whatever was passing for my faith life, and still does in Judaism, because she tried to emphasize that doubt and what she called, echoing the story from the Bible of Jacob and the angel, God wrestling, struggling with faith, is an integral part of faith. And for those people who maybe are turned off or question why Denise would become so devoutly Catholic, I think the thought that she's really at every moment wrestling with the dogma, wrestling with the teachings, wrestling with the ideas of Catholic faith is enormously helpful. The other thing I wanted to mention about this poem is that I believe it really reflects a lot of her father's side and connects very easily with the teachings of Kabbalah, which I've studied, especially and most directly in the last thing, Spark of Remote Light, which is could very easily be a reference to the informing myth of Kabbalism, which is that God poured his love into the world and it was too much and it broke up into little sparks of light that are contained in everything. And I know Denise really loved that myth and we talked about it a lot. So a spark of remote light is this tiny little piece of the divine in everything. And the idea of the human task of tikkun olam, of healing the world, of putting the world back together, it means gathering those sparks by sparks. So I think here you have a piece of her father's world and inside his father's world, because he tried to reconcile Christianity and Judaism, and her own having two very different parents coming together. The last thing I wanted to say about this poem, and perhaps maybe one of the most moving for those who knew Denise and maybe for those who've just read her, was what is she evoking here as salvation, as the path to salvation? She's evoking maternal love. The love of a mother for a baby is what God needs from us. And I think that that's an enormously moving idea. But for those who knew Denise and knew the fierceness of her commitment to politics and poetry, I think it's enormously moving for her to say, this is what we need for salvation, and to conclude this masterful poem with the idea of taking this Lamb of God, and bringing it to her breast. Okay, I look forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you, David. Very touching, very moving, and very informative also, especially on the religious aspect of the poem. Next, we will be hearing from Margo Taft Stever, whose 3 full-length poetry collections are The End of Horses from Broadstone, Cracked Piano from Cavan Carey, which was shortlisted and received honorable mention for the 2021 Eric Hoffer Award Grand Prize, and Frozen Spring, which was winner of the 2002 Midlist Press First Series Award for Poetry. She's currently an adjunct assistant professor in bioethics department of the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve University. Margo teaches a poetry workshop at Children's Village, a residential school for at-risk children and adolescents. She is founder of the Hudson Valley Writers Center, an amazing place. By the way, we will be hearing from them sometime in September, and founding and current co-editor of Slappering Hole Press. Welcome, Margo, and let's look forward to hearing your reading of The Breathing.
Thank you, and thanks to Mark for writing the important book, My University, and thank you to Cassandra Atherton and to you, Mark, for your wonderful reading series, which I've gone to many times. And also thank you, the three of you, for organizing this wonderful tribute to Denise. During my freshman year, well, first of all, I want to say that no one other than members of my own family had such a direct and profound impact on the direction of my life than Denise. In her MIT workshop, she did not adhere to the dictates of what constituted good educational practices at that time. She encouraged us to meet in our apartments and dorm rooms, in her summer cottage in Maine, at demonstrations at the seashore instead of the classroom. In fact, she was telling us that we could write and should write everywhere. She would bring a plant into the workshop and ask us to write about it. During my freshman year, after I got into her workshop, Denise wrote a letter saying that she would serve as my mentor, which enabled me to move off campus where I never lived anyway, so that I could live with Ernie Brooks and the members of the band of the Albatross. And actually, Ernie was also in Denise Levertov's workshop, and he's here tonight. And I did some secretarial work for Denise, though my skills were never proficient. And she taught us all about political activism. I will never forget what she wrote in her 1967 essay, The Poet in the World, quote, "People are always asking me how I can reconcile poetry and political action, poetry and the talk of revolution. Don't you feel, they say to me, that you and other poets are betraying your work as poets when you spend time participating in sit-ins, marching in the streets, helping to write leaflets, etc.? My answer is no, precisely because I am a poet. I know, and those other poets do likewise know, that we must fulfill the poet's total involvement in this aspect also." Ever since studying with Denise, I have viewed writing of poetry and work in the world of poetry as two integral parts of a whole. Inspired by Denise, I have tried to create opportunities for other poets through founding and establishing the Hudson Valley Writers Center and Slappering Hall Press, the center's small press imprint, by political activism, by creating literacy and writing programs in homeless shelters, teaching poetry also, and that's as well as political activism. During my freshman year, Denise was looking for a cover for her book, Relearning the Alphabet, and she asked me to bring my photographs to her apartment. During those years, I took my camera with me, even slept with it, and took pictures everywhere. I was one of the 100 students arrested during the Harvard strike. After the strike, Denise spread my photographs on the floor and chose one of several demonstrators looking out of University Hall at students looking in. She thought that the photograph looked like runes of an unknown alphabet. I documented this and other such memories in my poem about her, which is in my book coming out in April, The End of Horses. Some of my strongest memories of Denise are her mellifluous voice, her elegant, inimitable laughter, her joy. My husband, Don, recalls giving Denise a ride to DC and dropping her off in the parking garage at the Justice Department, where he worked as an environmental lawyer. And her riotous laugh when she recounted the last time she had been there at an anti-war demonstration in the Justice Department courtyard and was arrested. He also remembers picking her up at a workshop that she taught at George Mason University. When he entered the back of the room, she was asking a student, "Do you know what doggerel means?" She was never afraid to say what she thought, even if it would not bring her followers, a term that freezes so many poets of our time into a gel of conformity. She visited us in Biddeford Pool, Maine, where we would take walks to the point and little and big beaches. She found mushrooms of all kinds on the golf course, and I know she gave this interest to Mark. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of them. Denise visited us in Chevy Chase, Maryland, where she was doing readings in DC. After we moved, she also visited us in Sleepy Hollow, New York. One day when we were standing in our front yard, Denise told me that one has to provide the time for poetry by having the discipline to write, to keep a journal so that when the poem decides to appear, the author can be a vessel. She didn't believe that poets owned gifts for poetry any more than people could own land or animals. It was the poet's responsibility to provide the conditions for the poem, for the gift to be born. I'm going to read her poem, The Breathing, which Mark Pawlak and I both have hanging in our houses as a broadside. The Breathing. In absolute patience, trees stand up to their knees in fog. The fog slowly flows uphill. White cobwebs, the grass leaning where deer have looked for apples. The woods from brook to where the top of the hill looks over the fog, send up not one bird. So absolute it is no other than happiness itself, a breathing too quiet to hear. And from the end of my talk, I just wanted to read a few quotes by several reviewers that Chris Velver included in his Poetry Foundation article on Denise Levertov that seemed particularly relevant to this poem and to the importance of her as a poet. Quote, dignity, reverence, and strength are words that come to mind as one gropes to characterize one of America's most respected poets, stated Amy Gertzler in the Los Angeles Times Book Review, adding that Levertov possessed, quote, a clear, uncluttered voice, a voice committed to acute observation and engagement with the earthly in all its attendant beauty, mystery, and pain. Diane McCoskey, in talking about breathing the water, 1987 in Women's Review of Books, invade the religious elements in Levertov's work. Quote, Levertov's poetry, Wachowski said, like most American mysticism, is grounded in Christianity, but like Whitman and other American mystics, her discovery of God is the discovery of God in herself, and an attempt to understand how that self is a natural part of the world, intermingling with everything pantheistically, ecologically, socially, historically, and for Levertov, always lyrically. In his review of Light Up the Cave, Daniel Barragan stated, our options in a tremulous world, as they say, are no longer large. We may choose to do nothing, which is to say, to go discreetly or wildly mad, letting fear possess us and frivolity rule our days. Or we may, along with admirable spirits like Denise Levertov, be driven sane by community, by conscience, by treading the human crucible. Thank you.
Thank you, Margo. And we now hear from Mark again, who's going to read a little excerpt of his biography, memoir.
Yeah, thank you, Mark and Margo and David. Those are both lovely pieces. I just wanted to say that the title of the memoir, My Deniversity, it's kind of a reference to Ezra Pound's term, Esuversity. Which was, he meant the informal instruction that as the poetry master, he offered early American modernists such as Louis Zukofsky and New Directions publisher James Laughlin in Rapallo, Italy back in the 30s and 40s. And so that was my Deniversity was echoing that idea. So this chapter I'm going to read, it's very brief, is called Tribe and Tradition, and it begins with a quote from one of Pound's cantos. To have gathered from the air a live tradition, or from a fine old eye the unconquered flame. Denise saw herself as belonging to a poetic tradition that extended back through Pound and H.D. to Yeats, Swinburne, even farther back to the Romantics, Keats, Shelley, Coleridge, Wordsworth. On this side of the Atlantic, she affiliated with poets who took William Carlos Williams as their master, a modernist tradition that continued forward through the objectivists on to Charles Olson and the constellation we know of as the New American Poetry that included, among others, Robert Duncan, Robert Creeley, and Denise herself. This was a tribe I aspired to join. But she never thought of herself as an entirely American poet, and not a British one either. Rather, she felt she was a poet whose heritage was as much continental European as anything else. In a letter to Williams, circa 1960, she once wrote, "Certainly I am an American poet, if anything. I know I'm not an English one. Nevertheless, I feel the great European poets belong to me as an inheritance too." And so as one of her proteges, my exposure to literature was broad, deep, and international in scope. Before accepting the faculty position at Tufts, Denise had very much been an itinerant poet teacher which required her to travel to colleges and universities around the country for a few weeks, a month, or a semester at a time. Whenever she traveled abroad, accepting speaking engagements in Europe or visiting childhood friends in England or her mother in Oaxaca, she sent postcards. One card she sent me from Europe depicted Brunenberg Castle, built in the 13th century overlooking Murano in the Italian Tyrol. Dear Mark, her message on the back read, I'm staying in this very castle, have marked my window. She circled it with a pen. Mary Derechowitz, EP's daughter, and her family live here. It is incredibly beautiful within and without. In her characteristically unconventional fashion, Denise had taken a ballpoint pen to the picture and circled the window in the castle room she occupied. EP, of course, was Ezra Pound. His daughter, Mary, was Denise's friend and Italian translator. This was the same castle where Yeats, scrolling down too far, where Yeats had once been a guest and where Pound took up residence after his release from St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Denise told me that on another occasion that while visiting there, she had written letters and composed poems making use of the antique Remington that some of the cantos had been typed on. There she had sat in Yeats's chair and lived amid Pound's collection of Gautier-Brzez's sculptures and drawings. Robert Creeley, in an interview I once read, likened the experience of an apprentice learning by imitating his master to plowing a field. Learning to plow, he said, is both watching someone else do it and then taking the handle of the plow and seeing if you can imitate literally his way of doing it, therefore gathering the use of it for yourself. In Denise, I had the good fortune to watch a master as she went about her work and then try out for my own purposes the tricks and tools she had employed while still under her watchful eye. That kind of intimate guidance gave me the palpable sense of being inducted into a guild whose secrets were passed on, master to apprentice, from one generation to the next. And certainly I was aware enough of modern literary history at the time to understand something about what that consisted of. Although I was not yet confident enough in myself as a poet or in my calling to believe I was a deserving acolyte. But I quickly learned that once you were admitted to Denise's anointed circle, she took a keen interest in everything you did that became resources for your poetry, and that she followed your progress with rapt attention as you explored your own ways of working, slavish imitation being the farthest thing from her mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we hear from Arthur Tse, who received the 2021 Shelley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America. His 11th book of poetry is The Glass Constellation, New and Collected Poems from Copper Canyon last year. And his previous book, Sightlines, won the 2019 National Book Award for Poetry. Arthur is Professor Emeritus at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Welcome, Arthur, and I believe Arthur's going to read us a map of the western part of the County Essex in England.
Yes, thank you. I just want to start by saying thank you, Mark and Cassandra, for bringing us all together to remember Denise and celebrate her poetry. I want to read the poem first, and then I'll make a few comments. A map of the western part of the County of Essex in England. Something forgotten for 20 years, though my fathers and mothers came from Cordova and Vitebsk and Carnarvon, and though I am a citizen of the United States and less a stranger here than anywhere else, perhaps, I am Essex born. Cranbrook Wash called me into its dark tunnel. The little streams of Valentines heard my resolves. Roding held my head above water when I thought it was drowning me. In Hainault, only a haze of thin trees, stood between the red double-decker buses and the boar hunt. The spirit of merciful Philippa glimmered there. Pergo Park knew me, and Clavering, and Havering at a bower. Stanford Rivers lost me in osier beds. Stapleford Abbots sent me safe home on the dark road after simian quiet evensong. Wanstead drew me over and over into its basic poetry. In its serpentine lake, I saw bass viols among the golden dead leaves. Through its trees, the ghost of a great house. In Ilford High Road, I saw the multitudes passing pale under the light of flaring sundown. 7 kings in somber starry robes gathered at 7 Kings, the place of law, where my birth and marriage are recorded, and the death of my father. Woodford Wells, where an old house was called the Naked Beauty, a white statue forlorn in its garden, saw the meeting and parting of 2 sisters, forgotten and further away, the hill before Thaxted, where peace befell us, not once, but many times. All the Ivans dreaming of their villages, all the Marias dreaming of their walled cities, picking up fragments of New World slowly, not knowing how to put them together nor how to join image with image. Now I know how it was with you, an old map made long before I was born, shows ancient rights of way where I walked when I was 10, burning with desire for the world's great splendors. A child who traced voyages indelibly all over the atlas, who now in a far country remembers the first river, the first field, bricks and lumber dumped in it, ready for building, that new smell, and remembers the walls of the garden, the first light. I think this is an amazing poem of Denise's, and I wanted to read it because I think so often the poems that are anthologized are short, lyrical, very accessible poems. And I think Denise's achievement is much deeper and more complex and far greater than the recognition she's received. So it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here as part of this gathering. On a personal note, I want to say that I actually read Denise's poetry as a senior in high school, but I would never have imagined that a year and a half later at MIT, I would be in her poetry writing workshop with Mark and Margo. I think Ernie Brooks is in the audience, and a number of others. Denise was the first poet I met, and her presence was really profound. Mark mentioned that she was homeschooled. I'm just trying to sort of add to some of the things that have been said. She was homeschooled, but she was also trained as a dancer and had a lot of experience in dance and ballet. And I always remember my first meeting with her, stepping into her office and her presence and the way she carried herself and the way she used language, the kind of physicality and the kind of rhythm and passion for language and for poetry itself. It was there in my first encounter, and it just grew over the entire year I was in that workshop. I was to leave that after that workshop at the end of that year. I ended up transferring to the University of California at Berkeley, where Denise had taught prior to coming to MIT. And her example really gave me the courage to pursue poetry, to leave science and engineering behind, to the consternation of my parents, and to pursue a life in poetry. But it was Denise who was the first poet I met who just lived so authentically in the world and as a poet in the world, who set such an important example. In terms of this poem itself, I don't want to get too technical, but I just want to point out, I love how places on a map become personalized and become charged with intimate, emotional, and imaginative experience. She's tracing ancestry, her father's side, her mother's side, but I think she's also tracing not just that migration story, but immigration story to America. She's writing that poem as an American citizen, and yet she calls America indirectly the far country. When she thinks about where she's really rooted, where she belongs, and in many ways, this poem is that journey of going through landmarks and centering and finding where one can situate oneself. She's in Essex, she's in England. And the poem is 42 lines, it's only 4 sentences. And the way syntactically the phrases keep gathering and gathering and gathering, and they build toward that child burning for the splendors of the world. I just find that breathtaking and wanted to share that with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Wonderful. Next, we hear from Susan Eisenberg, who is the author of 5 poetry collections, most recently Stanley's Girl from Cornell, and the New York Times notable book, a nonfiction, We'll Call You If We Need You. Susan is a resident scholar of Brandeis Women's Studies Research Center. She directs the On Equal Terms project, exploring employment equity through digital media, visual arts, poetry, and witness. Her art installations about union tradeswomen exhibited at AFL-CIO building in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you. First, I want to congratulate Mark on your memoir publication, and to thank you and Mark and Cassandra for organizing this celebration of Denise. It's just been wonderful to kind of be thinking about it and have her just so alive in me as I kind of was thinking about this today. She's who introduced me, like so many other people here, to the craft of poetry. And I was an audit student of hers. I had an interview for that when she taught at Tufts in 75 to 76. And it was crucial, not just to introducing me to poetry, but as somebody who was at that time in a free fall from SDS, kind of a rescue, and learning from her that political poetry needed to be supported by craft and skill, and therefore needed great patience. It was to get those tools and to slow down was incredibly important to my life. I'm going to read the Poodle Palace from The Great Unknowing, which the last poems, which is a collection published in 1999 that gathered the poems that were finished, but not in any book. 2 years after, and it was published 2 years after she died. It's a poem of just 22 lines, but so much happens inside it that for me is emblematic of Denise. Back when I first read this poem, when it came out in '99, in a kind of gritty neighborhood of Boston that I live in, there was no such kind of place as a Poodle Palace. But now there are, I think, 4 such places in Jamaica Plain that we've been gentrified, including one that I passed by. If I walk my granddaughter home from her preschool, we passed by a place that advertises services of pet sitting and grooming services, and also offers to go on walks and hikes with your pet, and not just dogs, but cats and birds. So we have my granddaughter and I have a big laugh always about, somebody taking a bird for a hike. And I'm always think of this poem. And both of the title and just the beginning lines of the poem also just for me remind me of that Denise's wonderful sense of humor and sort of mischievousness. And I can remember being in her kitchen in Somerville when she was telling a story, and the story involved a dog, and suddenly she was on all fours barking, in the kitchen floor. And that was just sort of Denise. So the poem, I love that beginning, and it moves on, of course, from there. So the Poodle Palace. I never passed the Poodle Palace with its barber pole in the shape of a striped beribboned bone and the sign specializing in large and matted dogs, without remembering the bitter wonder of the taxi driver from somewhere in India who asked me, "What is that Poodle Palace? What does it mean?" And when I told him, laughed, and for blocks, laughed intermittently, a laughter dry as fissured earth, angry and sharp as the ineradicable knowledge of chronic famine, of human lives given to destitution from birth to death, a laugh on which the stench of ordure simmered, round which a fog of flies hovered, a laugh laughed to himself, whether in despair or hatred, and not as a form of address. He was indifferent to whether I heard it or not. I find this a very current political poem. So I also just really love that about it. And that feels so Denise. And also just so interesting that in her last years, as she knew she was dying, it was a poem that she wrote. Because the poem sort of captures my smug distancing myself from this Poodle Palace to like once his question is answered, all the agency goes to the taxi driver, this new immigrant worker, figuring out this first world culture that he's in, and positions me, the reader, in the backseat alongside the eye of the poem, and really in the backseat with the Poodle Palace, and brings us into just hearing and investigating his laughter and the political and economic realities beneath it that fill more than half the poem. For me, it's also heightened by Denise's British accent and the taxi driver being Indian, and of course, Britain having colonized India for 200 years. And I hadn't really thought about it till I was thinking about this today. It's as a work poem. I think both because I've just become the poetry editor of the journal Labor Studies in Working Class History and Culture, so I have that antenna up, but also because that was the work of my own. I became an electrician right after I did the workshop with her, and that was the writing of my own about work was what she most encouraged and supported. What I found, interesting, especially also knowing that Denise didn't drive, she would go on her scooter, or people would give her a ride or take a cab. So she was somebody who had a lot of experience in taxis, but this poem doesn't explore the taxi driver in any traditional way that often happens of his driving or him as a character or caricature, that it is a poem that's deeply about class and in a very expansive sense about colonialism. So that we, the reader, are reminded that before he's a taxi driver, he's a human being. And especially I find it like that taxi drivers make their money from fares and from tips, and that here he doesn't wait to let her off to start laughing. He laughs for the whole ride. so that just heightens and deepens the poem. So it just is, I guess, to say that also in her more accessible, shorter poems, there is also just so much complexity going on. So.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, you always have the feeling that Susan was somehow inside herself kind of chuckling about something. We next hear from Mark with a brief excerpt from My University, One Pilgrim's Progress. You there, Mark?
Yeah, I am. I was trying to share the.
Oh, right. Did you make? Yes. Mark is a co-host.
Yeah, he should be able to share.
I'm trying to share the. It won't let me do it. Okay, forget it. I'll try another time. I was going to share the photograph of the postcard of Brunenberg Castle, but keep going. So yeah, so let me read this next section. So Pilgrim's Progress, the book, was a very important book to Denise as a child growing up in England and then throughout her life, I think. And so I used the title for this next section of the memoir. Denise viewed her own life as a pilgrimage, a seeking out and following of uncharted paths, some of which turned out to be dead ends, which then required her to double back and set out in another direction. One day when I stopped in at Glover's Circle, which is her house in Somerville, she prefaced my day's, quote, lesson by reading me a quote she had just come across by the Russian critic Viktor Shklovsky. A crooked road, a road in which the foot feels acutely the stones beneath it, a road that turns back on itself. This is the road of art. We just pop up with these things all the time. She thought about the growth and development of young poets the same way. Provided you had the stamina, provided you persisted in striving to find your way, she believed you would continue to reach new and higher plateaus of achievement, which, if you didn't always recognize them right away yourself, she was always on hand, ready to point them out to you. This literally was the language she used in discussing new poems I would show her. With these poems, she would say, your work has reached a new plateau. She had a keen sense of timing about when to offer encouragement of just the needed kind. One such instance occurred during my first year after college when I was living and teaching in Santa Barbara and questioning my poet's vocation. Like Arthur, I had just given up a career in science. I sent her a compilation of all the new poems I'd written since our MIT workshop had disbanded. She responded with a 10-page letter from Oaxaca, where she was visiting her mother. Quote, you have grown so much in your poetry, she wrote. I'm really thrilled at your development. Of all the people in the MIT class, you've gone the farthest, and you started at almost zero. You're really doing good stuff. I was, of course, buoyed by her response and re-energized in my writing, even though I very much doubted that I had, quote, gone the farthest. In those early days, I frequently despaired that I was mostly stumbling in darkness, but Denise would invariably step forward at the right moment and illuminate my way, reminding me that, quote, our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task, quoting Henry James. The rest is the madness of art. And she always had these quotes, at the ready all the time. False starts and mistaken directions, however, were things Denise did not hesitate to point out, as when I wrote a long poem of over 200 lines about a teenage boy from a Cambridge housing project whose beating death at the hands of the police led to several days of rioting in the streets of East Cambridge. She took a keen interest in my firsthand reports of skirmishes between police and housing project denizens, and how teachers like myself, social workers, community organizers, and other activists got swept up in those events. She encouraged my involvement, But when I showed her the ballad I'd written, which romanticized this street urchin victim as a modern day Robin Hood, she didn't mince words. She called it a sociological poem with cardboard thin characters, lacking the complexity and individuation of real people. Such a frank appraisal was not easy for me to take, but in this instance, I came to realize she was right. But when I showed her new poems she thought were a breakthrough in my development as a writer, she used the phrase, quote, coming into a new country. To my mind, filled with 1950s TV pablum, this phrase conjured Fess Parker in the Disney film version of Daniel Boone, crossing the Alleghenies into the Cumberland Gap, via the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, quote, new territory despite its native inhabitants. But I suspect the image in Denise's mind was something out of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. The day I read her the first of several poems that would become the Buffalo Sequence, my first poetry collection, was one such occasion when she literally leapt up from her chair to hug me, exclaiming, that's it, you found your voice. After that epiphany, I could only stumble down the steps of her house and onto the sidewalk, transported by the knowledge that I was on the right path and had not, quote, lost my way in this uncertain and unmapped enterprise. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Next, we hear from Dick Lourie, who is a poet, editor, and musician. He's the author of 7 books. His most recent collection is Jam Session and Other Poems. Co-founder and still co-editor publisher of Hanging Loose Press, which they founded in 1966. He was a student in the first class Denise Levertov taught from 1964 to 1965. Dick, I believe you're going to read Letters to the Dead. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. It's so great to be here with everybody, and it just brings back everything. And actually, it's a different poem I'm going to read, Mark, but I'll get to that. It just brings everything. As Mark was saying, yeah, I was a student it was the first class that Denise taught anyway in this country, maybe the first altogether. New York City at the 92nd Street Y Poetry Center, the fall of 1964. I found her to be, as did the others in that group, to be what I believe all of us here have experienced. She showed us to us simultaneously as a teacher, an intellectual force of awesome proportion, and really a friend, like she was there with us. She wasn't, she was there around the table, and she was really around the table. She wasn't up behind the podium. It wasn't long before we all began meeting, as others have said. Soon we were meeting in the long, narrow apartment that she and Mitchell shared, the 3rd floor walk up on Greenwich Street, not Greenwich Avenue in the village, but Greenwich Street near Canal Street, what was then very industrial and decidedly unfashionable kind of neighborhood. And then when that fall semester ended, Denise says, let's just keep going. And we did that for another year, right, until 1965. It was in that group that I met Emmett Jarrett. A year or so later in 66, he and I and Bob Hirshon and Ron Schreiber, as Mark said, founded Hanging Loose Magazine and the Press. And in 1980, Mark Pawlak joined. So as I look back now and think over this kind of more than half-century operation, which is still going strong to a significant degree, it was Denise's doing. She, in that way that, again, we all know, in that way that she had of connecting people together. And I'm reminded now of what Margo talked about, and Susan, you know, those of us who were close to her were quite aware that her her sense of humor was as important and robust as her other qualities, though it was, of course, not the one she was best known for in public. And of course, she had a powerful laugh on her. And Denise visited me. The poem I'm going to read, it's a poem that I wrote. Denise visited me once when I was living in Ithaca. I wrote this poem later. Actually, I was thinking about it today. It appears that I wrote this poem maybe just a year or so after Denise's death. And it was about one incident, one aspect of that visit that I continued to cherish about Denise. The poem is called, and I'll spell this out for you, the poem is called Among the Dworkins, which is Dworkin, Among the Dworkins. Get the right light here. Carol and Denise, by coincidence, were both visiting me at the same time. Acquaintances without much in common, the New York Jewish princess married to one of my best friends, and the great poet, my first teacher, who I still feel close to. By chance, it's also the day my brother phones. Let me talk to him, says Denise, in a playful mood. They've met a few times, and she does have this small streak of mischief. He'll never guess it's me. And sure enough, when she says in her British accent, "Do you know who this is?" my brother, at a loss, casting about, lights on some old friends of my father, an English couple and their children. It sounds like a Dworkin. He thinks, Denise reports, her hand over the phone, he thinks it's a Dworkin. And just the word itself sends Carol and Denise into shrieking hysterical fits that somehow establish a particularly close bond that lasts until Carol's death 8 years later. They exchange Dear Dworkin letters, little elf statues. They greet each other, "Hello, Dworkin," and they are prone at any time and in public to collapse giggling. This shared identity suits the two of them in some mysterious and deeply comic way. It's the kind of joke most people greet with polite silence, or at best, incomprehension, of course. And now, Denise is gone too, and of everything there is to remember, what I think of now sometimes is the way she and Carol came to my house that day and how they laughed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dick. That was wonderful. Next, we shall be hearing an interview between Donna Krolik Hollenberg, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Connecticut, the author of 6 books and many articles. And 2 of her books are about Denise Levertov, A Poet's Revolution, and Denise Levertov and Denise Levertov and Company. Donna and Mark, well, you have the floor.
You put it back on. Yeah, wait. I got it.
You should mute yourself, Dick. Don, are you there?
Did Donna manage to navigate the...
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Now you can hear me. Okay, good.
Hi, Donna.
Okay, good. I said that I very much enjoyed reading your book again, Biodiversity. Okay, so my questions are on page 61 in the discussion of Denise and Mitch's disagreement about Charles Reznikov's development as a poet. You agreed with Mitch that Reznikov was a better poet than Zhukovsky, and Denise thought differently. How did Denise react to your siding with Mitch?
Yeah, I don't know. So I remember the conversation. I don't know if I actually articulated that I sided with Mitch out loud.
Oh,
But I certainly did. And, I mean, I thought it was odd that, she was very close to Creeley, and, like Creeley, who accumulated this, vast number of brief poems, which was sort of became his kind of epic, in short iterations. That was, largely Reznikov's mode as well. His strength was, these short, epigrammatic almost poems. And so, I just thought it was peculiar. And, Zhukovsky is very ambitious and can be impenetrable at times. And I just thought the directness of Reznikov just really connected for me as his observations of the city and his anecdotes of overheard conversations, etc. As he walked the streets of Manhattan, really I just felt really strong and powerful, and so yes, he was he and Mitch and I both really resonated with that aspect of Reznikov. Yeah.
oh, okay. On page 65, you say that Denise preferred friendships with people half her age to her contemporaries. Why do you think that was?
So I think, this good question. You have to bear in mind that I was writing that at a time when this is the early 70s. She was, deeply committed to anti-war activity, and she had really kind of broken ties with a good number of poets that she'd been really close to. I mean, by then, she and Duncan, her famous break with Duncan was had happened a few years before, over her focus on writing political anti-war poems, and which she thought was kind of moving away from her lyrical strengths, and he thought it was inappropriate. And they really had a big falling out over that. And she also, was so committed to stopping this war with great passion, that she felt, she really associated with young people like myself, who, were some of whom were more radical than I were, SDS, and were into kind of, using violence if necessary to, quote unquote, bring the war home, which was the phrase at the time. Holding demonstrations and tearing up railroad tracks in Cambridge to bring attention to the fact that the U.S. was bombing Haiphong Harbor and railroads and bridges in Hanoi. And so she broke with a number of her longtime poet friends, and wrote some poems in which kind of accused them of being genial poets. And so, yeah, so we, she kind of surrounded herself with some people who were myself and other contemporaries. And it was also a time when I think she and Mitch were their marriage was on the rocks, and I think she was lonely in some way. She kind of isolated herself from her contemporaries.
Okay. On page 82, you talk about befriending Denise's mother in Oaxaca. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes. So in 1974, I had just, I'd been teaching at I'd helped start an alternative high school in Cambridge for kids who were kind of dropouts from the Cambridge public schools. And I did that for a number of years. And then I just decided, I'm gonna take the leap, quit my job, and really and just dedicate myself to poetry. And myself and Richard Edelman, who was another MIT poet, who were very close to Denise, decided that we just needed to leave town for a while. And Denise encouraged us to take a trip to Mexico, where her mother lived. And so we did. And we went for like 3 months. We traveled all over Mexico, and Denise plied us with books and advised us in places to go. And we started in Merida and worked our way north on third-class buses, with pigs on our laps and things like that. And eventually got to Oaxaca, where we looked up her mother and spent a considerable amount of time visiting with her and talking with her. After Denise's father died, her mother came to, as you know, Donna, her mother came to live with Mitch and she in that tiny apartment in New York. And Denise had just gotten a Guggenheim. And so it was an untenable situation to live in those cramped quarters. Their son, Nick was young. And so they moved to Mexico to live cheaply off their Guggenheim for a number of years. And her mother went with them. And then when the time came for them to return to New York, Denise's mother decided she had befriended the family. They were living in a hacienda with an extended Mexican family. And she stayed on as the official abuela for that family and lived the next 20 years in Mexico. So so we met her in her late 80s. So she had a few more years to live when we met her, but she was a really vibrant person. She was painting, writing poems. I helped Denise organize a small collection, a sheaf of poems that Denise paid for to be printed of her mother's own poems that she gave her as a 90th birthday gift.
Nice.
Yeah, so she was quite a dynamic person, her mother, really interesting woman.
Okay, last question. What did Denise like about the editorial choices made by Hanging Loose, which you write about on page 157?
I think you mean dislike.
What?
Dislike or like?
Yeah, what didn't she like?
Yeah.
Did she not, what did she not like?
So Denise, even though, as Dick said, and he may want to weigh in on this, even though she was in some ways the catalyst for himself and Bob Hirshon and Emmett Jarrett and Ron Schreiber to come together to start Hanging Loose. Prior to that, Emmett Jarrett and Ron Schreiber had a magazine, and then Dick joined them, called Things, which lasted for about 2 years prior to Hanging Loose. And of course, it was, the idea was it was named after, no idea, but in things, William Carlos Williams' phrase. And Denise's contribution to the first issue was the essay that's in the Poet in the World, called Admonition, in which she took them to task for their kind of editorial preface, borrowing from Williams, that she thought they were interpreting his phrase too narrowly. And so she publicly just took them to task in the very first issue as their kind of mentor and contributing editor. So she was never afraid to do that, And I think over time, and again, this is my perception, that Denise grew to, she used to use she liked to borrow the phrase from Pound. When she described poems, she would talk about, phanopoeia and logopoeia, and the sense that poems are either musical or logical or imagistic. And I think over time in her own poetry, she came to associate with the musical element more and more. And I think the editorial direction of Hanging Loose editors over time grew to be more kind of the logopoeia, more prosy, and so that was one of the objections I think she had. And I think we also over time became closer to New York School poets, second generation New York School poets. And I think she was never entirely fond of the New York School, and so she saw that going on as well.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's my interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe others want to, maybe we could open it up. Does that make sense?
Sure. If someone wants to ask a question, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say something to follow up from Mark. I think that us, we at Hanging Loose, I think that after a while we began, partly as Mark said, we were friends with and appreciated the things that people in the New York School were writing, and I think that Hanging Loose really, we widened our aesthetic. I don't think that we stopped. I think we widened rather than abandoning what Denise wanted, or what Denise her way of looking at poetry. I think that was still there, but it was in form that she didn't want to see. I think that we had wider taste. I think that within the logopoeia, we also had images, and she wasn't able to, didn't want to see those, and we so in a way, in a way, it was as if we floated away, to some extent. But I never felt like we gave up. I never felt that we left behind the aesthetic of Williams and of Denise. Mark, what do you?
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think of Zukowski one time. He kind of characterized the range of poetry as an integral. In the calculus, with the lower range being speech and the upper range being song, and that poetry, could traverse that range from one lower scale to the upper scale.
That's well put. Yes.
And I think we began. I think we always liked poems within the whole range.
Exactly.
Over time,
Exactly.
Grew more, felt a stronger affinity to song, I think.
I mean, we
musicality, really.
and we we continue to publish. I mean, if you look at an example, we published somebody like Charles North and Tony Toll, who are really New York poets and New York School poets, I would say. And we also published 3 or 4 books by a poet named Wilma Elizabeth McDaniel, who was a retired farm worker in California and had migrated from Oklahoma in the 30s. And this was, we really do have that kind of range. And yeah, and I think that Denise was not comfortable with the extent of the range. Was that fair, Mark?
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I just wanted to also make a comment about I'm glad Susan and Dick echoed Denise's humor and spontaneity. I remember there's a letter exchange between Jay Laughlin and William Carlos Williams, in which Laughlin tells Williams that Denise was in his office when he read a poem, I believe it was, that Williams had sent. And she was so delighted with it that she jumped up on his desk and did a jig. And it was just that kind of spontaneity that, you know, could burst forth at any moment. Or get down and bark.
We were at Denise's one time visiting, and it was shortly after she and Mitch had separated, and she got kind of wistful, and she said, you know, I haven't mushroomed since I left Mitch. I said, no, but Denise, you've blossomed. And there was this tremendous laughter. I mean, she knew how to laugh.
Sorry, but I have to go.
Okay, thanks, Donna.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
So, Donna's biography is really terrific, based on a lot of interviews as well as archival research. It's really to be recommended. I think the other thing, and Margo had mentioned, you know, the first collection of her essays, "The Poet in the World," you know, which is in my mind a classic. I mean, it's you know, Denise's, you know, the essays that are often talked about are her essays about craft, you know, about the line and the line break. But there's this philosophical underpinning in that book, I think, that I find really moving. And I think people should, you know, go back to it and look at this. There's one essay called "Great Possessions," which is about, you know, just, you know, the great literary traditions and also her involvement with Rilke. She was deeply, deeply influenced by Rilke, and really a powerful influence in guiding her to follow her own path, but also as a kind of philosophical resource. She was always just, you know, spouting quotes from Rilke to me. Do others have questions or want to comment?
There's a couple of questions in the chat, one from Caroline and one from John.
I just wanted to know how your interactions with Denise have influenced how you and Dick have approached Hanging Loose, your work there.
I think, well, one way is, you know, the way we go about selecting poems for the magazine, which is, you know, after, so she really emphasized in her workshops the oral dimension of poems, you know, hearing them, taking them in by way of the ear. And when we make our final decisions on poems in the magazine, after we've all read them on the page individually, and then we come together for a quarterly editorial meeting, we forget the votes we previously had because the poem made it to the table, and then we read it aloud, and we make our final decision based on taking it in by our ear. And so I think that's one of the profound influences that she had on the way we do things at Hanging Loose.
Okay, so I guess I had the question. I think of MIT as a science and engineering school. I'm just wondering how a poetry class infiltrated that institution.
Good question. You know, there was, so it certainly was there, you know, and there was a provost at the institute when I was a student there, who was he kind of wanted to humanize us engineers, you know, and so he started having a poet in residence, Lillian Hellman, a writer in residence. Lillian Hellman was writer in residence 2 years before Denise. He also brought in, there were basically, you know, American documentary film started at MIT. Pennebaker, the Maisel brothers, Fred Wiseman were all teaching at MIT. You know, the beginnings really of American documentary film. And then there was a Bauhaus influence. So he brought in Georgie Kepes from the Bauhaus, and we started a kind of technology and art collaboration there as well. And you know, the photographer Minor White. I took a class from the photographer Minor White, who was, you know, published Aperture magazine and was a very famous photographer. So there's all these amazing artists around as well. I don't think that was true, you know, prior to that. When I started at MIT in 1966 as a freshman, they had just instituted a humanities requirement.
Mhm.
And they didn't have a faculty, so they went up the street to Harvard and hired all these graduate students at Harvard to teach the humanities classes, because they had no.
Did it ever go the other way? Did any poet just decide, screw it, I'm going to go into chemistry? Or
Yeah, probably, you know, but not that nobody in that class that I knew of. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. The other, is this
Thank you, everybody. Is that, are there any?
I think David's got a question. He's got his hand up.
Okay, David?
Yeah, I was gonna, am I unmuted? I do think so. Okay. I was gonna comment on this question of Denise's relationship to the avant-garde. You know, because in 1969, at the workshop she taught at Berkeley, a number of the members of that workshop were people who were busy trying to establish the language poetry school. Ron Silliman and Ray Armentrout were all in that area. You know, so, and they were very, very taken with Denise's position as an avant-garde poet, but it soon became clear that that wasn't reciprocated, that she had really very little interest in language poetry. And she once explained to me, how can they call themselves the language poets as if all the other poets don't write in language? So I think it became a very interesting journey for her. And of course, because she didn't really come from any particular, as an immigrant, she didn't come from any particular school. She just sort of fell into one. And, you know, so that the affiliation of the poets with the poets in the Allen anthology, like Creeley and Duncan, and we know what happened with Duncan, she kind of drifted away from them stylistically, and you know, and her tastes became more sort of, I guess, what you'd call mainstream in some ways. So I don't know if Mark, you want to comment on that? I think you touched on that.
I think you're right on there, on the mark there, yeah. I mean, I think she, first of all, she was always very much an individualist. I mean, in some ways, you know, she objected to being called the Black Mountain poet, because it was like a convenient organizing principle for the anthologists to kind of group people in these different schools. And I don't think she, you know, I mean, she was close to Creeley. Creeley was a friend of her husband's, and they spent a lot of time together, and would visit Williams together, and felt very, you know, a real affinity there in the early years. But she didn't really feel that the Black Mountain description. Well, I think she had a hard time with Olson. I mean, she liked, you know, she taught his projective verse essay, but she never really, in my sense, to my memory, talked a great deal about his poetry and having a great affinity for it. And so, yeah, I think she was very much her own person. And of course, you know, she came out of the kind of, you know, the new romanticism in the English school before she came to the States. And then she, you know, gradually, it took her a while to even be able to read Williams. She has these great stories about, one of my favorite stories is the day she's, you know, the phrase, you know, back in the 50s, people used to say excitedly about something, hot dog. And she said, it was years before I realized that they weren't talking about a wiener. You know, and it was just that sense of American idiom that it took her a while to comprehend. And then she was able to read Williams and understand what he was doing with language. But yeah, I think she was very much herself. And the quote I read earlier on about feeling that, you know, her European inheritance was just as strong as any other influence. Absolutely true. You know, that was really, I know that Miłosz admired that of her, you know, that she had that kind of broad perspective.
I thought that Denise's objection to the language poets was frequently that she felt that meaning was so important to poetry, not, you know, musicality, yes, lyricism, but also meaning. And she felt a lot of language poets were impenetrable in that area. And that's what she really, in my view, in my recollection of talking with her, that she objected to.
Good. Makes sense. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me.
One time she emerged, I think from the John at my house with a book of Ashbery in her hand. She said, "David, I've just understood an Ashbery poem for the very first time."
I find this all very interesting and stimulating, and it makes me think of the variety of poetry and the variety that of which poetry is capable. My name is Jack Anderson.
Yeah, hi Jack. Yeah. Absolutely.
Hi, Jack.
Yeah.
Hi, Jack.
Hi,
Yeah.
hi. And I think that sometimes Denise sounded very narrow, sometimes marvelously eclectic and Catholic in the best sense in taste. And I'm glad that we've had this discussion because we are avoiding classifying her too narrowly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
I think also that you know, it depends partly. What's your definition and what's your understanding of avant-garde? And you know, you could say Denise was, yes, she was a member of the avant-garde, sure, who never thought that it was the job of the avant-garde to abandon the past. You know, to do something with it, to incorporate the history into what you're doing in an avant-garde way. But I think that there were others, you know, of various movements that were called avant-garde who literally, you know, busted up and start all over again. And that, of course, was never Denise, although she certainly was, you know, part of the forward movement.
Good point.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody.
I think Ruth's got her hand up.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you all for this. It's incredibly moving. I'm a little bit confused because once Denise wrote that projective verse had been widely misunderstood, that it didn't have so much to do with the breath as it did have to do with the thinking. And she said, when the mind pauses, that's when you break the line. She said, that's what Olson really meant. When the mind pauses, that's when you break the line. But once I showed her a poem of mine, and she said, well, it's okay, but don't you see that this word here has to go on the line above? And she gave me the traditional, you know, 5 or 6 reasons for doing so, like a unit of sound, a unit of meaning, or the emphasis on the last word, or the emphasis on the first word of the next line, and so on. And I never could reconcile those two things. And also, it was interesting to me that she was such a stickler, of course, for form when she lived here, and when she moved to Seattle, she became much looser. She said that the subject matter that the poets out west were writing about was more important, that is ecology really, than the form of a poem. And that surprised me enormously. That was a huge change.
No.
And I think I'm going to hand it over to Cassandra, because there are a couple of our regulars here at Lit Balm who would like to read a poem dedicated to Denise or influenced by Denise.
Yes, absolutely. Gosh, that was a fantastic show. I just feel incredibly moved by it as well as really inspired by it. So amazing. One of my favorite lip balms. And we're just going to round it out with some of our brilliant regulars who are going to have some fantastic poems to read in open mic. And the first person is Bob. Now, Bob is back. Bob is in his kitchen. We've missed him. We love him. And he's going to read first for us today. So, Bob.
Okay, except it doesn't really have anything to do with Denise, I'm afraid, but
that's okay.
Information. Remembers how to write, remembers how to kiss, remembers how to count, remembers the difference between the bumblebee and the hummingbird, between the color red and the number 5, between the man and the woman, between the sky at night and sky in the morning, between the hand when it is open and the hand when it is closed.
Beautiful. Between the color red and the number 5. I love that. It's beautiful. So glad that you're back. You're back and we can engage with you and your kitchen. DeWitt, one of my favorites, is back. He looks very dapper today, people. DeWitt's going to read for us next. I'm just asking to unmute and hopefully that.
Unmuted. It's great to see everybody. This is called Settling Scores. At odds, getting even. Eye for eye, teach a lesson, tit for tat. Old wrongs nursed. Resentments, envies, injuries, cost to me, benefit to you, your advantage, my expense. 2 households, both alike in dignity, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny. In Shylock's case, the grudge is more specific. The Christian merchant hates our sacred nation, spits upon his Jewish gabardine, yet seeks his cash for love. Shylock blames the Christians for his daughter's betrayal rather than strict parenting. One scapegoat threatens another. If you prick us, do we not bleed? Prods and tapes in Belfast. Debts and debtors. Satisfaction, equity and reckonings. You never let it go, do you? My father to my mother after decades in recovery. Bitter mercies. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. For Buddhists, bad karma. We're not enemies, we're rivals. A campus colleague warned me about opposing his tenure. Give me your best shot, but then watch out because I'm giving it back. This is my life I'm fighting for. Solomon's parable of dividing a baby claimed by 2 mothers. Who loved it most? The one who surrendered it so it would live. Break a butterfly upon the wheel. Justify the ways of God to man. A writer's quarrel with the world. For wound, the bow of art. Yet, morality in the novel means keeping your thumb off the scale.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I always love what you read. A writer's quarrel with the world. I'm going to move that forward into my work too. The next person is Cindy Hochman, who always astounds us with not only her spunky way of delivering her poetry, but her amazing poems. So Cindy, you're up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Definitely.
Okay. Like Bob, my poem has nothing to do with Denise Levertov, but I've enjoyed this Lit Balm very much. But it's Valentine's Day in 2 days, and I'm going to read a poem. It was called For You. It's for my ex-husband, and I wrote it about 30 years before he became my ex-husband, my husband. And I just renamed it Valentine's Day. It's written in couplets. And you were there, first date, when we took a surrealistic bath. And you were there through sexless nights of moons and tantrums. And you were there propelling me safely over anxious mountains. And you were there through violent Valentines and all our gentle wars. And you were there through tea time and toxins. And you were there with your thumbs raised, your eyebrows raised, your penis raised, and your guard down. And you are here now, unsheepish, leading the herd. And I just want to say that about 35 years ago, Hanging Loose turned down one of my poems, but I forgive you.
That was great. I loved that, Cindy. You did say poets put moons in their poem, and you had a moon and a penis. So we're doing well. Let's hope people don't have violent Valentine's Days or tomorrow in Australia. And lucky last, we have the amazing John Wambach Wessex, who always delights us with something fabulous or extraordinary or strange. So John, can I get you to read your poem to round out the open mic?
Of course. Cindy Hochman started me on this saga with her poem about Bob Heeman's kitchen. Jonathan Penton isn't here today, but if Cassandra can put her hat back on, we can pretend. This is called Jonathan Penton's Vodka and Cranberry Juice. And it's a prose poem. Not to get bogged down in history, but Russian emigres drawn to Massachusetts by the promise of Thanksgiving side dishes invented the drink. From there, it traveled via the Erie Canal and Mississippi River to New Orleans, where it fueled Anne Rice's obsession with Transylvanian plumbing. Leonardo DiCaprio ordered one in The Departed, which is a remake of the Hong Kong action movie called Infernal Affairs. There's nothing satanic about vodka. Mark Twain wrote about it in The Celebrated Fermented Potato of Calaveras County, and it was said to be the inspiration for the character Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird. Of course, murder is wrong, but any bird insulting my manhood is in for a beating. Animals lack respect these days. I blame social media.
That was awesome. Thank you. I wish that I could have Jonathan's vodka and cranberry, but it's only 11 a.m. here, so I might wait. But it would have been perfect if I could have coupled the hat with a heavy vodka. Mark, I think that puts us back to you with your wonderful voice and your wonderful ability to pick something to round out the show, I think.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, everybody who was involved in this fantastic Denise Levertov celebration, including Arthur Say, Margo Taft Stever, Dick Lourie, Susan Eisenberg, David Shaddock, and Mark Pawlak, of course, and Donna Krolik Hollenberg. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful show. And may Denise's spirit thrive and fire into the universe. to sort of cap this off, I wanted to read one of Denise's poems, and it's called Another Spring. In the gold mouth of a flower, the black smell of spring earth. No more skulls on our desks, but the pervasive testing of death, as if we had need of new ways of dying. No, we have no need of new ways of dying. Death in us goes on testing the wild chance of living, as Adam chanced it. Golden mouse, the tiled smile of the moon. And I repeat, the tiled smile of the moon, westering of the black window, Caldera of the spring. Do you mistake me? Am I speaking of living, of moving from one moment into the next and into one after, breathing death into the spring air, knowing air also means music to sing to. Music to sing to. Thank you everybody for this wonderful Denise Levertov celebration. Well, just very quickly, our next show features some good friends of ours who will certainly be able to delight without surety, or with surety, sorry. As long as I can call it up. Here we go. So yeah, February 26th, which is 2 weeks from now, we have Caroline Wright, Susanna H. Case, Maria Mazzotti Gillen, and Lilo Way reading for us. And on March 12th, we have Glenn Maxwell from the UK, Ben Mazer from Cambridge, Andrea Julia Skrudon from Romania, Katya Kapovic, and Philip Nikolaev. So please join us for those shows. And there are many more exciting things to come. In fact, we have scheduled all the way through September. So if anyone has an idea that they'd like to broadcast, please broadcast. Thank you everybody for such a wonderful show. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dick. And thank you everybody else involved in this wonderful dedication to Denise Levertov. Have a great night. Love and poetry. Keep well. Bye, guys.
Happy Valentine's Day. Mwah.